committee is meeting today for the consideration of two measures. I do not have any opening remarks at this time, but will rather speak to the bills once they come under consideration. So I now recognize the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, have no opening remarks and look forward to addressing both these bills.
Pursuant to Committee Rule 3H and House Rule 112H4, the Chair announces that he may postpone further proceedings today on any question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment on which a recorded vote on the ayes or the yeas and nays are ordered. The first item for consideration is H.R. 2018 to amend the Wild Free Roaming Wild Horse and Burros Act, sponsored by this gentleman from West Virginia. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands be discharged from further consideration of the bill. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered read and open for amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. The Subcommittee Chairman, gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Rahall, will shortly be offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute that we have developed to the pending measure. Prior to recognizing him for that purpose, I would recognize myself to explain the legislation. 3 days from now, some of the best 3-year-old thoroughbreds in America will line up to run for the roses in the Kentucky Derby. This annual ritual, which has been termed the most exciting 2 minutes in sports, generates more widespread public attention to the horse than on any other day. Yet at the very moment when the crowd stands to sing My Old Kentucky Home, in tribute to the horses assembled for the race, nearly 30,000 wild Mustangs, a symbol of America, stand captive in federal holding facilities. Nearly half of the American wild Mustangs are currently being held in these facilities, and the agency charged with their safekeeping, the Bureau of Land Management, now publicly speaks of killing these majestic creatures as a solution to a burgeoning budgetary problem. While Americans cheer on the thoroughbreds at Churchill Downs this Saturday, I would submit that the plight of the American Mustang is not something of which we can be proud. The pending legislation seeks to remedy the critical lapses that are taking place under the Wild Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act of 1971 by invoking a number of common sense measures. There are 4 basic aspects to this legislation. First, it would promote the use of better science to determine whether the amount of range that is available to wild horses is capable of sustaining them. This would be accomplished through maintaining a valid inventory of the wild horse population on the range and the establishment of appropriately scientifically based methodologies to determine management levels. Second, it would increase the amount of range available to wild horses through a combination of public lands and private lands controlled by entities seeking to establish sanctuaries. The 1971 law stipulated that wild horses would continue to roam free from harassment in the area they were found when the statute became law, and that this area was, quote, an integral part of the natural system of public lands, end quote. At the time, this area comprised 53.5 million acres of federal lands. Today, that area is 34.3 million acres. We are in deficit by 19 million acres, and nobody, including the BLM, can explain what happened to those 19 million acres. We have asked them. The GAO has asked them. They just do not know. But what we do know is that less acres for wild horses to roam freely, upon which to roam freely, translates into more roundups and larger populations in federal holding facilities, further aggravating the financial resources available for this program. The pending legislation would require the BLM to make the wild horses whole, so to speak, to reinstate the original, lawful 53.5 million acres, and by doing so, reduce the number of animals that are called from the herds and placed in holding facilities. In this regard, the legislation speaks to using land acquisitions, exchanges, conservation easements, and voluntary grazing buyouts. It also provides the BLM with authority to enter into cooperative agreements with private entities to establish wild horse sanctuaries on non-federal lands. Many of us have heard of the Pickens Plan, not the T. Boone one, dealing with wind and solar, but rather the one advanced by Madeline Pickens to utilize private resources for the establishment of wild horse sanctuaries. Third, even with the actions I've already outlined, there will not be enough open range to sustain all wild horses. In an effort to contain the costs associated with holding facilities, the pending measure seeks to bolster the adoption program and implement sterilization and other fertility controls. And finally, what the bill does not allow is the destruction of healthy horses. Fatally injured or terminally ill animals, yes, but not healthy wild Mustangs. That concludes my explanation of the bill. Now recognize the subcommittee ranking member, Mr. Bishop, for any remarks he may have.
In an effort to try and get this moving along, I'll withdraw. I will not give any opening statements as of NAT. I will wait until the ANS is submitted.
Does any other member have opening statements they wish to make? If not, the gentleman from Arizona is recognized for 5 minutes to explain our amendment in the nature of a substitute, and without objection, the amendment is considered read.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me thank you at the outset for bringing this important legislation forward. As you noted, the investigation by the Government Accountability Office documented the wild horse and burro program continues to be plagued by inefficiency and ineffectiveness, resulting in BLM's recent suggestion that the agency might have no choice but to kill thousands of healthy animals. A better solution includes more options and more rigorous management, and the ROMAC will provide both. It includes reasonable tools such as the use of fertility control, the establishment of sanctuaries, and a much more robust adoption program, all leading to more efficient, humane, and constructive management. Mr. Chairman, the purpose of this substitute amendment I am offering is to address some practical concerns that were raised during consideration of this legislation. In trying to make this bill as effective as possible, we sought detailed input from a range of stakeholders, including the administration and wild horse advocacy groups. Based on their experience and their efforts in the field, they provided us with a solid foundation of the underlying bill by including recommendations received from these stakeholders over a 6-week process. Perhaps the most significant, the substitute provides a definition of the term thriving natural ecological balance, which appears in the 1971 law but is not defined. The definition makes clear that management of horses and burros should seek to achieve balance, multi-use of public lands, ensuring the health of all aspects of the range. Testimony from the Director of Game and Fish Department from my home state of Arizona highlighted the need for such a definition, and the substitute provides one. The substitute also defines the term fatally injured or terminally ill to provide the agency with more guidance regarding cases in which euthanasia is appropriate. Further, the substitute makes clear that while those adopting wild horses and burros can gain title to these animals, the prohibition against selling them to slaughter is permanent. The substitutes do not go as far as the agency or animal welfare groups want. Rather, it refines the original bill in several key areas to make this legislation as balanced and as effective as possible. I urge the adoption of the amendment and support for the final passage of H.R. 1018, and I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield to a question before he yields back?
Sure.
He's okay?
Yes, please.
Can I ask a couple of specific questions about the ANS that's here before us? The fertility efforts, what specific fertility efforts are being added into this particular bill?
That discretion would be up to the agency.
So it's nothing that is new that the agency is not already doing?
Potentially, but the discretion is with the agency.
What about the sanctuary land that will be established? The goal then is to create roughly another 19 to 20 million acres of sanctuary land. If you try and bring it back to the 71 level, the goal is to create another 20 million of sanctuary land.
Yeah, correct. To return that acreage.
Does it have to be contiguous land?
No, it does not.
Who is left to the discretion on where to pick that land?
The agency.
And it'll have to come from public land.
public land or, yeah, primarily,
Would gentleman yield?
or private acquisition. Conservation easements, as it was stated in the chairman's opening comments.
Where will we find this land? I recognize the bill does not specifically say, but there are some realities of life.
In
Where will
response,
we
it would
find
be
20 million acres?
in the existing BLM land, and
Would the gentleman yield?
256 million
I'll yield
that
to anybody.
exists right now.
I don't have the
If
time.
Gentleman from Arizona has the time, would he yield?
Certainly, Mr. Chairman.
First, in response to the fertility question that the gentleman from Utah asked, yes, the Bureau already has that authority. They're not exercising it, so one of the purposes of this legislation is to try to get them to, we're prodding the agency to do what they already have the authority and ability to do in regard to where the land would come from, the additional 19 million acres.
Mr. Chairman,
The legislation provides for a willing seller, Madeline Pickens maybe.
if you can find a willing seller, otherwise it has to come from public lands?
Wherever we can find the land, wherever the agency can
So if
find
it's
the land.
not a willing seller, it'll probably be public lands. Let me go back to fertility as well, because the department is doing some fertility projects. Does
Great.
this bill envision a different project than what the department is already doing? Or is
Just
it
more
same
expansive
science?
of what they're doing on a very minimal scale currently.
Does the chairman know of the efficacy of what the department's already doing?
What they're doing now, to my knowledge, is only small pilot projects.
Yeah, but is it working in those small pilot projects?
Not enough to make a difference. That's one of the goals of this legislation, is to get it working better.
Yeah, that's one of my fears. If we're expanding something that's not doing, well, the pilot project isn't working, expanding it may not necessarily have a greater efficacy than the pilot project itself.
And it may.
Mr. Chairman, in our subcommittee hearing, we did talk about where this 19 million acres that you say disappeared actually was. It went away simply because some of those 19 million acres were private and state holdings, which had to be withdrawn, and the rest did not meet scientific standard for adequate habitat. There was a reason for that not necessarily being there. So that was part of the testimony that came out. It didn't just mysteriously happen. But once again, I'm looking at here, do you have a logical area in which this 20 million acres will be there? Can I find 20 million acres, for example, in your home state of West Virginia?
Of public lands?
If, actually, as you said, there may be private donations, but yeah, let's talk about public lands first and then see if you got private donations.
Well, first, there are 256 million acres of BLM managed public lands
In West
alone.
Virginia?
And the GAO, not in West Virginia,
Oh,
no.
I'm sorry, okay.
And the GAO, you referenced our hearings, the GAO did not agree with the assumption the gentleman from Utah just stated.
Well, actually, the expert from Arizona did at that time, but he told us how those things took place. So I'm still looking for the 20 million acres, which we have very effectively not actually put in this particular bill. And I got to have some assumptions where it's going to be. I mean, last time we were on the floor with this particular bill, we had a gentleman from Virginia and a gentleman from Ohio, one from Kentucky, and yourself speaking about it. As I understand, there are no wild horses being held in any of those particular states. So am I making the assumption that those will not probably be a repository area for this particular program?
Well, you know, what we're trying to do is get the agency to use the authority they already have, to use their best efforts, as the legislation states, to identify new appropriate rangelands for wild free-roaming horses and burros, including use of land acquisition,
But, Mr.
exchanges,
Chairman, if the
conservation
aforementioned
easements.
4 states would simply take 5,000 head apiece, we would solve the problem,
That's up to the agency.
or the states. If
Yeah.
those states that
Yes.
don't have the public land would find the private land to actually do it, we could solve this problem without having to expand any of the public lands in the West, wouldn't we?
You know, what I keep saying is, if the agency can find the land, find the willing sellers, we're trying to prod them to do that.
I just would like
And
to
if
know.
they can do it, fine. That meets the goals of this legislation.
The problem is, if we have a mandate that 20 million acres has to be found, there's going to be a reality of where those 20 million acres are. And I think the state that would probably end up with those 20 million acres does not have a representative on this committee.
The gentleman is making it sound like that a state, like this is a nuclear dump or something that we're afraid to accept. I would be proud to have my home state accept such. I don't know what.
Can we write that into the bill? That the excess horses will go to the state of West Virginia?
the land has to be found. My district's not particularly a flat roaming area for horses.
And my district doesn't have particularly enough habitat for 10,000 extra head of horses either.
Your land's
Well,
a
we
little
do have
flatter
land.
than mine.
The
Gentleman's time has
is
expired, by the
yes.
way.
Mr. Chairman, I have a question.
Gentleman from Utah?
Yes, I have one question, if I may. This amendment prohibits the adoption of horses for being used for commercial purposes. How would you define, what is the definition of commercial purposes?
The prohibition to selling the animals to slaughter, I think the definition would be food.
So that definition of commercial purposes could and probably should be narrowed to the slaughtering of horses, because there are many acceptable uses I would hope that you would find for the use of horses, from dude ranches to petting zoos to therapy and pack mules, photography, uses in movies. Are these things that you would object to, or
No,
can
they're
you narrow?
allowed in the bill. I think the specific prohibition is the slaughter, and you asked me to define that prohibition, the use of that, and it would be food.
Would it be exclusively for food? Because the way it's written here, if I'm reading it right, it says at page 10, section 2, lines 3 through 7, each individual adopter shall execute an appropriate attestation pursuant to section 1001 of Title 18 United States Code, affirming that adopted animals and their remains shall not be used for commercial purposes. It's so broad that I worry that the interpretation would prohibit things that you don't intend to have it prohibit.
I feel that the prohibition is specific, but we'd be happy to work with the gentleman for specificity on that point that you brought up. But
That would be great. If it would be exclusive to the slaughtering, and that would be great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman from Small.
I would just like to ask a question to the gentleman, the chairman of our subcommittee on parks, concerning the issue of horses, and I was wondering if there's currently a data available on exactly how horses are being utilized, because I think one of the big concerns that horses are being slaughtered for the purposes of feeding them to dogs and cats, and I want to know how much of that is part of the big businesses that goes on among the pet food companies that do this. Is this a right question to pursue? I'm just curious if this is the concern that the gentleman from Utah has raised.
yeah, thank you. And if I may respond, it's a problem. The percentage of and the degree of is something I can't provide the gentleman at this point, but it is a problem, and this legislation seeks to eliminate and avoid that problem.
But I would like to request, if possible, the gentleman submit for the record exactly how many horses are being slaughtered every year for the purpose of using them as pet food, and how much the big pet food companies are involved in the process of slaughtering these horses for that purpose.
Well, most of it is foreign, but I will make every effort to respond to the gentleman's request.
I appreciate the gentleman's response.
Further discussion?
Yes.
Gentleman from Utah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, our goal in dealing with wild horses and burros should be to devise a management plan which will allot habitat to have a balanced and self-sustaining relationship. The original bill was deficit in several areas that have been addressed in the amendment in the nature of substitute, such as now using helicopters to gather wild horses, as we found that that's a more humane and effective way of doing it than what had originally been banned in the first version. What we still need to do is have scientifically based land management practices. I understand that many of the witnesses talked about how the horse represents the romance and mythology of the American West. It fires our romantic imagination. But unfortunately, those horses still live in the real world. This amendment only further tilts this legislation away from responsible science-based management towards romance. And it consistently has, for horses whose number have been consistently underestimated by the BLM. And perhaps that is why your administration spoke against this bill in the hearing, and I don't think they have changed their opinion of it yet, at least it has not been communicated in that particular way. We are dealing with a species that has an exploding population and yet are willing to treat it as if it were an endangered species, in fact, giving it priority above endangered species, which simply means there is untold potential unintended consequences of this legislation that could harm the environment, endangered species, energy development, grazing, who knows what else. There are unclear definitions in this bill. The gentleman from Utah illustrated one in which commercial does not necessarily mean being slaughtered for food. In fact, the BLM prohibits in any of its sale of animal any resale for human consumption or for slaughter. So it obviously would go to other types of commercial entities, as the gentleman suggested, that happen to be there. I also, once again, am worried that once again we are not dealing with science. It was science that took the number of the habitat down to where it is today. We need science to bring it back to where it ought to be. But this trumps science. This says there will be land and it will be found, and somehow it's going to be found, whether it's logical, whether it's rational, whether the habitat is there, and I am very worried about where those assumptions are. We should have gone through and made that very clear. The gentleman from American Samoa looks like he wants to have this question. I'll yield to whatever you want, Ian.
I appreciate the gentleman's yielding to me. Just wanted, for purposes of dialogue with the gentleman, while we're debating and arguing over the points of whether or not the status of horses here in America, I don't know if the gentleman's aware that in Kazakhstan, they raise horses specifically for the purpose of human consumption. Horses meat has been exported all over the world, especially in Europe, among the most expensive restaurants. And they, in Kazakhstan, they have for breakfast, for lunch, and for dinner, horse meat. And also is one of the most nutritious, better meat than it is in cattle, from what I understand it to be. And I just wanted to from the gentleman, if he has any concerns about that in other parts of the world, it's perfectly acceptable for human consumption, horse meat.
I recognize that's considered the norm in many parts of the world. However, we've already passed legislation in this country that bans that practice and bans the selling of horses or transportation of horses for human consumption or slaughter. What we're now dealing with is what to do with the 47,000 head of horses which have outgrown the habitat that we have for it. Obviously, there's an effort trying here to find an expanded habitat. That habitat may or may not be, depending on how we define it. There are other terms in here, like we talk about how you will only put a horse down if it is terminally ill. If it's injured, if it's sick, if it's hurting, that's not the same thing as terminally ill. And that's what the kinds of questions that the BLM has problems with. Once again, we have written a piece of legislation in here that was not talked about in the hearing. The hearing talked about a bill. This one went back behind closed doors, and we came up with a new version. In fact, I would like to have another hearing on this so we could find out what this one really does and some of these questions to be answered. But this is the one before us for a markup, and there are still a whole lot of questions that should be answered by people who understand the science of dealing with horses, not the romanticism.
And just one more point to
I will
the
actually
gentleman.
go back to
I wonder
my
if the
time.
gentleman also understands that I think horse meat has been imported and it's being served in some of the most expensive restaurants in New York City. And my question is, this is apparently allowable, that we can import horse meat from other parts of the world, and yet within our own country, this is not permissible, at least to some extent. Just wanted to note that the gentleman understand.
I thank the gentleman for that. I did not know that was the situation. Thank you for the information. Mr. Chairman, do you want me to go on, or would you like me to yield back?
What's that?
Do you want me to go on, or would you like me to yield back?
Yeah, I'd rather you go on to your next meeting, but if you want to go.
Somehow I thought you would, but you're rolling votes, so I'd still come back when it counts. I yield.
Gentleman yields back his time. Further discussion, the amendment in nature of substitute? Any amendment to the amendment?
I have.
Did the gentleman say giddy up?
Yeah, but I'm on a Burros, so they won't listen anyway.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment without
I actually have
objection.
I have two amendments, Mr. Chairman. Do you care which one goes first?
Oh, I really do.
Okay. I am thinking of which one goes first, and the answer is, all right, let me do the second one, which is the opt-in, opt-out one, which is already at the desk. We have. And I think they're in your packets too, aren't they?
That amendment is in the members' folders, and without objection, be considered as read and printed into record. And the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain it.
Thank you. I'll try and be mercifully short on this particular one. I mentioned earlier that we are trying to find X number of acres for expanded habitat. And I recognize that in this particular bill, once again, it is not clear of where that habitat may or may not be. And also, it is not clear what the unintended consequences were. I can think very clearly that if there were 20 million acres that were going to be found in state X, let's pick one for random, like Nevada, all of a sudden you have alternative uses on that land in what has traditionally been the purpose of BLM land for multiple use, that now this language would trump that language. So all of a sudden you have unintended consequences of what do you do with the people who are already using that particular period of land. In addition to that, what we have found in reality, not in the romanticism of horses, but in reality, is we have become very restrictive on what people can and cannot do with private horses. The easiest way, under the rules that we have now established in law, is for somebody with a private horse that no longer has the means of maintaining that horse to dump it on public lands. Any state that will now be designated as having 20 million acres of this will have the unintended consequences of finding a lot of other horses, not part of the domain of the BLM, that will now become part of their state. And it will have an unintended consequences. And because we are talking about such a massive amount of land, it is my intention to have a bill there that simply a governor of a state, who would therefore have to face the consequences unintended in this legislation, but will nonetheless be there because reality has shown that's what happens, to have the ability of opting in or out of this particular sanctuary. And once again, I'm sure the governors of West Virginia and Ohio and Kentucky and Virginia would love to be able to take some of these animals and would never opt out. But if we decide at our discretion to put all 20 million acres in one particular contiguous spot, that may become unacceptable in certain areas. And it certainly fits with the 10th Amendment, which allows states to have some kind of control over their resources, some kind of control over their territory, and some kind of control over the unintended consequences that Congress may impose upon them. I submit this for your consideration. I'll actually yield back to you.
I just have a question.
Okay.
So the gentleman is opposed to the option of the states opt-in or opt-out on oil and gas leasing, yet he is for the opt-in and opt-out.
Actually, in the Comprehensive Americans for American Energy Act, we indeed allowed the states that kind of option on the Outer Continental Shelf. And in fact, I would be more than happy to allow the state that kind of option on things like oil shale development and maybe oil and gas leases, which we have already established going through the land management plan, and the Secretary of Interior decided to take off the table at some particular whim. Yeah, I would love to see the states have that kind of option because I know where their choices would be. And it's the same kind of choice they should have in this particular measure. So yeah, Mr. Chairman, I am consistent on both those issues.
Gentleman from Arizona wishes to be recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment needs to be defeated because I think for the first time it allows a state to veto federal land management decisions regarding federal responsibilities on federal land. The 1971 law required the Secretary to consult with state wildlife agencies and the Wild Horse and Burro Advisory Board in order to establish a range of horse and burros where they were advisable. Neither the substitute amendment nor the Bishop amendment alters that provision. But the Bishop amendment would insert a later section in the 1971 Act stating that the consultation requirement in law for 38 years is no longer sufficient. Now, for the first time, the governor can veto federal decisions on federal land. If this amendment were adopted, the 1971 Act would state that wild horses and burros are a federal responsibility, but we delegate the responsibility for determining where they should live to the governors. This represents an abdication, I think, of the responsibilities set forth in the 1971 law. I think it creates a very troubling precedent regarding management of federal lands and resources. What other veto powers should governors have over federal decisions? Should the secretary have a similar power to veto state decisions regarding state lands? Obviously not. And for those reasons and the precedent that it sets, I would urge a no vote. Then I yield back.
Any other member wish to be recognized for discussion? Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to associate myself with my colleague, Mr. Bishop, on the comments he made for the simple reason that I've personally seen this. Let me give you an example of what happened. There was a gentleman in my area that had a bunch of ponies. He utilized them in his business for kids' rides, and he had about 100 ponies, and after a while, kids stopped riding those ponies, and so he decided to put them up for sale. He couldn't sell them. Nobody wanted the ponies. So he put a big sign on the pasture that said, free ponies. And he went back to check a few days later, and his pony population had dwindled down to 93. And he checked back a few days later, it went down into the high 80s. And he comes back a few days later, and he had 120 some odd ponies in his pasture. And I think this is exactly what's going to happen if we don't have state control and have some way of managing these horses and burros. We've got, under the Constitution, the 10th Amendment says that if a power is not specifically given the federal government an authority under the Constitution, in other words, the 18 things in Article 1, Section 8, if it's not prohibited from the states, those powers are reserved for the states and the people. By and large, politicians in both parties have forgotten that premise, forgotten what the Constitution says. And we need to start returning powers back to the states. So I'm highly in favor of this amendment. The only way to control horses or wild burros or any animal is through responsible, scientific-based management practices. The federal government is dismal in their management practices. The states are better. And we need to, in my opinion, put all the management back in state hands, because that's the way we're going to be able to have sustainable populations of all wildlife, including horses and burros. I yield back.
Mr. Chair.
Who's seeking recognition? Gentleman from Utah, Mr. Spence.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of this amendment, as I believe states also have play an important role here. It's not as if the horses necessarily stay within certain boundaries. If you were to look at a map of Utah and see the checkerboard approach, you'll see that states also have to deal with a huge impact. I have these, beautiful horses that roam throughout our district, but I also wish you could see the devastation and the inhumane treatment that we leave these when they don't have the proper rangeland to thrive and survive. And that's the untold side of it. It'd be great to see increasing numbers. People think, oh, that's great. But you don't see these things literally dying on the deserts of Utah like we do.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, I yield to Mr. Bishop.
I appreciate the gentleman from Arizona giving a well-researched reasons for not accepting this amendment. However, I do take one exception to what he said. There is precedent for exactly what we are doing. Currently, coastal states have, for any authorized federal authority or activity that's done in the coastal zone, do have veto power. It is in statute, and it's appealable not to interior, obviously, but to commerce, but it is there. There is precedent for what we are doing. This is not unusual, and it is rational, because there are going to be unintended side effects that the gentleman from Utah just mentioned. There is precedent for doing this, and it is the right thing to do. I'll yield back to the gentleman from Utah.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Is there further discussion on the amendment? If not, the question's on the amendment to the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Bishop. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Roll call has been requested. Pursuant to the chair's prior announcement, proceedings on this roll call will be postponed. The next amendments, Bishop number 2, not going to offer it.
Mr. Chairman, I'll withdraw.
Bishop number 2, amendment.
Actually, number 2
Oh.
is the one we did. I'll withdraw number 1. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
It hasn't been offered, so no unanimous consent is needed to withdraw. Gentleman from Utah, Mr. Chavez, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In lieu of the technical issues with the amendments, my amendments 19 and 20, what I want to do is offer an alternative amendment. This should be the Joint Advisory Board, number 1.
We have that amendment? The amendment is in the packet.
Yeah, they're passing it out. Should say number 1, Joint Advisory. My apologies, Mr. Chairman. The Joint Advisory Board amendment is in the packet. So I'm offering 2 amendments. We'll still go to the second one if that's all right with you. I'd like to
Doing
address is the Joint Advisory Board.
Davis Amendment number 2.
Number 1.
Oh, number 1 we're doing.
Number 1 should be in the packet. Then with your permission, I'll go to number 2 after.
Okay, we're doing number 1 now. All members
Yes.
have that amendment in their packet.
Yes.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, printed, and record, and the gentleman from Utah is recognized for 5 minutes to explain it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, what this does, my amendment would ensure that a nonpartisan advisory panel that is responsible for the management, protection, and control of wild horses and burros on western public rangelands would be composed of individuals who best serve the interests of all local, state, and federal interests. Those who sit on the Wild Horse Advisory Board ought to be the best when it comes to wildlife management, rangeland management, animal husbandry, and natural resources management. The board should also be guided by sound science, as opposed to some of the rhetoric and the majestic visions that some may hold. Therefore, my amendment would place 4 scientists on the panel, accompanied by 2 members of the agricultural industry, 2 from the relevant state grazing boards, 2 from the environmental community, and 2 from animal protection agencies. Similarly, it only makes sense that these members of the board reside in the states which make up the current range of wild-free roaming horses and burros. The appropriate management level, the optimum number of animals on the range, is about 27,200 animals, although the BLM currently manages over 34,000 animals or horses and burros. We have to get this board right. There's too much at stake for these involved parties: ranchers, farmers, city and county leaders, horse enthusiasts, and animals themselves. It is imperative that the board is guided by leaders who have the experience and expertise with the range, wild horses, and the integration of the two. My amendment that is up for consideration would do that, and would make sure that we have the proper individuals with the relevant experience from a variety of interests involved in making those types of decisions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And the amendment, I think, seeks to impact the makeup of the Wild Horse and Burro Joint Advisory Board, but there's a contradiction in it, and I think it might have what I believe will be unintended consequences for negating the whole, could potentially negate the whole advisory board altogether. The Joint Advisory Board is a critical tool that BLM uses to manage the program. Those members are selected to serve on the board by the Secretary. The underlying act says that no state or federal government employee can be selected as a member of the board for the potential of conflict of interest. This amendment does not strike that prohibition, but goes on to call for the inclusion of 2 representatives from the state agency, I believe the grazing agency, the grazing board to be exact, to serve on the advisory board. So if we proceed to adopt this amendment, it would make the section on the advisory boards conflicted, and the underlying law would be completely inconsistent and could potentially prevent the establishment of these advisory boards. So I would ask my colleagues on that contradiction to oppose the amendment, and I yield back.
Yes, if I could, Mr. Chairman. precisely the point you made near the end of your statement, that there are a variety of interests, and that what this seeks recognition of is the fact that there are some state interests that should be part of it. They can't unilaterally do anything under this amendment. They are simply a portion of the board. And so the whole idea and the concept, particularly if we were to have a map here of Utah, and you were to look at the checkerboard approach on how Utah is dealing both with state lands and in federal lands, it does recognize that, particularly from the State Grazing Board, that they ought to at least have a participant on that board to be part of the discussion. I think that's fair. I think that's in the spirit and the notion of what we're trying to do here. To say that they have an interest, I think, is accurate. It's fair, and should be a participant on the board.
Discussion on the gentleman from Utah's amendment? If not, questions on the amendment, the gentleman from Utah. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. Opinion chair, the noes have it.
I would ask for recorded vote.
Roll call has been requested, and the chair's prior announcement proceedings on this vote will be postponed.
Thank you.
Are there further amendments?
Mr. Chairman, I do
Gentleman
have a
from Utah.
second amendment.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, printed into record, and the gentleman from Utah is recognized for 5 minutes to explain it.
This should be number 2, the alternative. I want to make sure that everybody has this one. It's a simple amendment. It simply says that in identifying or designating any new rangeland, that the Secretary of Interior and the Secretary of Agriculture should take into account and avoid conflicts with potential development that's going to happen with wind, solar, geothermal, oil, natural gas, energy transmission, all of those types of energy needs that this very committee is also considering, that they should be in consultation, and that there should be a recognition of the fact that we're trying to do a couple of different things on these rangelands, and we are trying to do a couple different things on our public lands, and that there ought to be consultation and interaction, particularly with the Secretary of Energy, or Secretary of Interior, and the Secretary of Agriculture as we consider these needs.
Would gentlemen yield?
Yes, please.
Beautiful amendment. Chair accepts it.
Good news. Best news I've heard all day. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Is there further discussion on the amendment? The gentleman from Utah may be against it.
No, I'm just wondering. I'm just wondering, Mr. Rahall, or Mr. Chairman, if you accept the amendment, what did he do wrong?
You didn't speak on it. The questions on the amendment.
It's terrible when the chairman always gets the last word, isn't it?
Questions on the amendment. The gentleman from Utah, Mr. Chavis.
You can call me anything you like. That's fine.
Excuse me.
Nothing
All
further.
those in
Thank you.
favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Opinion chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is accepted. Are there further amendments?
Mr. Chairman, I ask.
Gentlelady from Wyoming, Ms. Loomis, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to submit a opening statement for the record, and as well a letter from the Wyoming Game and Fish Department that we just received today that is in opposition to the legislation before us. So may I submit those
Without
for the
objection,
record?
they will be made part of the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would also like to offer some amendments, starting with this amendment number 1. This is an amendment to the ANS.
We have it.
Thank you.
Members have the amendment. Without objection, will be considered as read and printed into record, and the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes to explain it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Wild Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act of 1971 set into place the recognition of 2 important facts: that wild horses and burros deserve a place on public lands within the framework of a multiple-use policy, and that those horses and burros must share that space with native wildlife and livestock. As a result, management of federal rangelands is a balancing act that recognizes the importance of all the users of the range. Today's legislation elevates the importance of wild horses over native wildlife and even endangered species. Rather than attempt to mitigate the damages on wildlife and the ecosystem of the range, this legislation would make the problem worse by exporting it to other areas. This First Amendment simply removes the authority to expand the rangeland for wild horses beyond the agreed-upon horse management areas. Mr. Chairman, every other large animal that uses the range is managed and monitored to maintain the health of the rangeland. Livestock grazing allotments in Wyoming have been reduced 20% in the last 10 years in response to drought conditions. The game and fish manage wildlife to a degree, but wildlife go wherever they can survive. Horses, by contrast, will reproduce at a rate of 20% in good times and bad, and the only management tool available is to remove horses. Horses compact the soil, destroy riparian areas, and use sage grouse leks for roll areas. That increases the bare ground. Sage grouse, as you know, are being managed as endangered species and threatened species. I've been told of an eyewitness account of a wild horse stallion chasing down and trampling an antelope that had been trying to access a water source. In other words, horses are the bullies of the range. They are a non-native invasive species that is not managed in any way other than restricting their area of use and their numbers. The 1971 bill limits the rangeland to about 29 million federal acres, but the proposed legislation would open up to an additional 130 million acres. At an annual reproduction rate of 20%, it is only a matter of time until wild horses become the bullies of the entire 160 million acres, not just the bullies of the 29 million acres where they currently reside. And this legislation will have accomplished nothing. So do we really want to set ourselves down this path? The bottom line, Mr. Chairman, is rangeland health can only be achieved with management of all the large animals that must share the land. Expanding the areas only means that we will be forced to manage a larger area at a much greater cost, and it's difficult enough, Mr. Chairman, to manage the areas we have now. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Balance of your time. The gentleman from Arizona, wish to be recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment, if passed, undermines the original intent of the 1971 Act and one of the fundamental purposes of the legislation that we are discussing today by limiting the range available to wild horses and burros. Horses and burros were found on approximately 53.5 million acres of public land when the law was originally passed in 1971. Today, they are limited to only 34.4 million. The legislation will require BLM to open new areas to horses and burros so that the 53 million acre figure can again be achieved, a number the 1971 Act clearly contemplated and that H.R. 1018 seeks to restore. But this amendment would strike the language altogether. In effect, the bill requires that about 19 million acres, or just 7% of the 256 million acres BLM manages again, would be available for horses and burros. BLM currently manages 7.5 million cow-calf pairs on 160 million acres of public land. By comparison, this adjustment that will be required to comply with the Rome Act is relatively minor. Further, if other tools authorized in the bill, such as adoptions, contraception, and agreements with private entities, if they are successful, horses and burros may not actually use all of the new areas open to them. Finally, the loss of range for wild horses and burros to roam over the past 40 years is one of the root causes of BLM's management crisis. It is one of the significant reasons we revisited this law. Without more range, the wild horses and burros simply have nowhere to go. But this amendment simply puts us right back to square one, providing no solutions to the loss of range and instead just compounding the problem. Effectively, this amendment guts the underlying legislation, overturns one of the fundamental principles established in the 1971 Act, and it should be opposed. With that, I yield back.
The discussion on the gentleman's amendment, gentlelady's amendment, sorry. If not, the question is on the amendment. The gentlelady from Wyoming, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Opinion chair, the noes have it.
Mr.
Noes have
Chairman, let's move on to amendment number 2 then.
And the
Thank
noes
you.
have it. The gentlelady is recognized to explain her amendment number 2, which we have, and without objection, be considered as read and printed into record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Amendment number 2 would require that the Secretary of the Interior study the impacts of an increased range area By elevating the status of the wild horse above wildlife and rangeland health, we are drastically changing the ecosystem. Now, Mark, note we're elevating horses above elk, deer, bear, mountain lions, sage grouse, endangered species, endangered plants. We are elevating horses that are non-native species above all these other species. We should not contemplate an expansion of this magnitude without fully understanding the effects on rangeland and wildlife health. My amendment would require that we study this proposal before making a decision that we might otherwise regret.
Gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you. In opposition to the amendment, I believe it's a step backwards to the requirements that are already contained in the substitute. The substitute for the first time provides a definition for a term that has been in the underlying law since 1971. The term thriving natural ecological balance, and the definition, let me quote from the text of the bill: a condition that protects ecosystem health, the ecological process that sustains ecosystem function, and a diversity of life forms, including those listed under the Endangered Species Act, and further ensures that wild and free-roaming horses and burros, livestock, and wildlife species are given fair and equal consideration in the allocation of resources on these lands where said species are authorized or managed consistent with FLPMA and other applicable law. The substitute requires that wild horses and burros are managed to achieve a thriving natural ecological balance and in a manner consistent with multi-use mandate in FLPMA. This amendment asks the Secretary to study things like rangeland health, riparian zones, endangered species, but the underlining substitute already requires that public lands be managed to protect these values and more. The requirement already in the substitute to protect ecosystem health, function, and diversity is far stronger than the suggestion in the amendment that we study these things. The amendment, I think, is a step backwards and should be defeated, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I would just add that in order to understand thriving natural resources, we need to study them to see what they need to thrive. And I would further ask that when this amendment is voted on, that we have a roll call vote.
Would the gentlelady yield?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
I believe we might be able to reach agreement here if we can reach agreement. Let's see, strike. If we could strike from the gentlelady's amendment, this authority shall not take effect until, and insert after 2 words later, the word secretary, secretary shall assess, and strike conduct a study in both places. Okay, if the gentlelady is not ready to respond, we can set it aside and have the staffs work on it and come back to it after the other amendments?
I would appreciate that, Mr. Chairman.
We'll do that then. Without objection, we will set the gentlelady's amendment aside and let her proceed to her next amendment.
Well, Mr. Chairman,
Gentlelady
I'll
from
just
Woman's Record.
accept the amendment. I'll just accept your amendment.
By unanimous consent,
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
yes, let me read it again. Except that, and here's what we strike. This authority shall not take effect until. Strike that phrase.
Okay.
Then we go and insert, the secretary and insert shall assess and delete conduct a study on in both paragraphs of her amendment.
Yeah, it is. Yes, Mr. Chairman, the amendment is acceptable, and I appreciate your willingness to work on it. Now I can withdraw the next amendment.
Where's the word study? A further modification.
So I'll just withdraw the third.
In both paragraphs where the word study appears is used a second time. Is the gentle lady following me? Results of the study. What we would additionally propose is to strike the word study in both paragraphs and insert the word results of the assessment. Assessment is the word we would insert. This is a conforming amendment with the changes made earlier by the gentle lady's agreement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That is acceptable.
Is there objection to the unanimous consent to make the recommended changes the chair has just announced in the gentle lady from Wyoming's amendment in both instances? If not, the questions on the gentle lady from Wyoming's amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed likewise. Opinion chair, the ayes have it. Gentle lady's amendment's accepted.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In light of that, I would like to withdraw amendment number 3.
The gentle lady has not offered it yet, so therefore there's nothing to withdraw. No unanimous consent needed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for my departure with protocol. Could we move on then to amendment number 4?
The gentle lady is recognized. We have amendment number 4 in our packets. Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, printed into record, and the gentle lady from Wyoming is recognized for 5 minutes to explain it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's legislation elevates wild horses above both wildlife and the sensitive ecosystem those horses are supposed to share. In the worst of times and during particularly sensitive times like spring runoff, these areas require very careful and coordinated management to protect the health of the rangeland. To illustrate this, we're passing out some photos of a wild horse range in Wyoming. These photos were taken on the Green Mountain allotment a full month before livestock was turned out on this range. The top photo is a riparian area. The mounds in the foreground and midground are called hummocks, and they're caused by hoof action during partially frozen land conditions. Wildlife do not cause hummocks, and livestock was not on this land. This is specifically horse damage. The bottom photos show significant damage to the soil adjacent to a small water source being used by horses, again, a month prior to any livestock use. They have trampled the soil, broken down the banks near the water with their solid hooves, and caused water quality to deteriorate. The second picture is a close-up of the trampling damage at the water resource. The bill today, Mr. Chairman, removes the ability to reduce wild horse populations, even where there's evidence of damage to the plants and water quality. My amendment would allow horses to be removed from public lands when they threaten the health of native plant life. In addition, in the unlikely event of an infectious disease outbreak, we must have the tools to remove wild horses. We must also understand that horses threaten wildlife species in other ways. Horses use sage-grouse habitat for roll areas, for fly bunches, and that increases bare ground and harms sage-grouse habitat, which we're desperately trying to manage at considerable expense as a threatened species. My amendment would allow for the removal of horses that threaten wildlife species. Now, the purpose of the amendment is to recognize that horses should not be elevated above every other species, both plant and animal. So if you're voting no on this amendment, you're choosing horses above every other species. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Yeah, to the gentle lady, I don't think it's a question of choosing one above the other. It is, I think the amendment as proposed goes at the core principle of the 1971 Act, and it goes toward an integral part of the natural system of the public lands, as was stated for wild horse and burros, and this has been federal law for 40 years. I think the amendment in the section creates a second-class status for wild horse and burros, and that is not the intent nor the purpose of 40 years of federal legislation. The second section requires that wild horse and burros be removed from public lands if they are determined to be a threat to the health and well-being of native plant or wildlife species. The underlying substitute requires that horses and burros be managed in a thriving ecological balance on the range. That means balance of all aspects of the ecosystem, not one above the other. And given this particular requirement, there's no need to amend the substitute to restate that individual pieces of the ecosystem need to be protected and treated equally. I think the substitute provides that protection to the entire ecosystem. This amendment focuses on protection of one aspect of the ecosystem, and I believe is unnecessary and should be defeated, and I yield back.
Mr. Chairman,
Gentleman from Utah is recognized.
if the gentleman from Arizona would consider, in the amendment, it says the secretary shall remove. What if it were to say may remove? I think having the option would give the types of flexibility to understand that there are varying capacities on what we're dealing with in terms of not only other wildlife and other species, but also dealing with native plants and other. How would the gentleman react to that if I were to suggest it?
Thank you. I believe that the substitute in the legislation already has that implicit authority for the secretary, and I don't think any additional.
Could you help me just understand where specifically that is?
Be happy to discuss that with you.
If that's the spirit in which this is trying to be done, I'd just like to see it articulated as clearly and definitively as possible, because there are varying circumstances in certain areas depending on where it is, and that's the concern. I don't know if the gentlelady would accept such a suggestion and the change to the language, but perhaps that would give the flexibility that would be needed.
The assumption that we'd be glad to work with the gentleman on the specificity to that definition that you're talking about, which we think is implicit and explicit in the legislation already. Be glad to work with you on assuring that that is the case.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman. If I may ask the question of the chairman, this is your bill, and the gentleman from Utah on the amendment that Representative Lummis of Wyoming has given a unique concept there, that indeed this bill does change prioritization, and having the flexibility to say may would be a positive step forward in allowing that kind of flexibility, as we all want to do management plans. It is your bill, Mr. Chairman, and you were not asked that specific question. Can I ask you if you'd accept the word may rather than shall in that particular amendment?
I don't agree with the gentleman's first assumption that this bill
take
changes prioritization.
Take the premise out. Would you still accept the word may?
We will consider it.
I asked a question, you gave me an answer. I can give you the Declaration of Independence right now from memory. Would that be helpful?
We will consider it as we move forward on this legislation.
You looked as if you wanted something else. I don't have anything else, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Further discussion? If not,
Mr. Chairman?
gentleman from Wyoming, a gentlelady from Wyoming.
I would ask for permission to amend the amendment to accept Mr. Chaffetz's amendment, which would strike the word shall, insert the word may, and then proceed to a vote on the amended amendment.
Without objection, the proposed change to the gentlelady from Wyoming's amendment is accepted.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The question now is on the amendment by the gentlelady from Wyoming. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion chair, the ayes have it. Ayes have it. Housekeeping matter, as we have 3 votes coming up very shortly on the floor of the House, and we only have one more amendment to do here. Members, help me if I'm wrong on that. But we will do the General Lady from Wyoming's last amendment, then proceed immediately to vote here. Committee, get our votes out of the way before starting to vote on the floor of the House. Are there further amendments?
Mr. Chairman, I wish to be recognized to offer amendment number 5.
General Lady from Wyoming is recognized. The amendment is considered as read, printed into record, and she's recognized for 5 minutes to explain it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Following passage of the Wild Horse and Burro Act of 1971, the range was defined as a herd management area. However, those areas included private and other lands that proved difficult and expensive or impossible to manage. In a series of decisions with significant public input, the BLM created the horse management areas in use today. For example, just west of Worland, Wyoming, an area was reduced in size. The BLM couldn't keep the wild horses from camping on the hay fields in those private lands, and that's why the herd area was reduced to where the BLM could fence to keep the horses on federal lands and off of private lands. Today's legislation would force these private lands to be added back to the herd area. I have other examples as well. For example, in Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico, some 1971 herd areas were reduced in size because the BLM did not have a water right and couldn't obtain a water right. Today's legislation would force those lands to be added back to the herd area. No one here is arguing that we should reduce the range land. We simply don't want to expand it. And the language will expand it to areas the BLM, with public and sometimes judicial input, has already decided is untenable for wild horses, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you. In effect, this is essentially amendment number 1 that the gentlelady from Wyoming offered earlier, and the reasons for opposition then remain the same for this one, and I yield back.
If the gentlelady would yield, the chair would only state, I think we finally got to the guts of the gentlelady's efforts today, which is to gut the entire bill, and that's what this amendment does. Chairman would oppose.
And Mr. Chairman, with that in mind, I would ask for a roll call vote.
We haven't put the question yet. The chair will put the question on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman,
roll call is requested, and prior to the under the chair's prior announcement, proceedings on this vote will be postponed. Are there further amendments? If not,
Mr.
the
Chairman,
chair. Yes, Chairman.
Could I just ask unanimous consent to have a letter from the Public Lands Council be placed on the record?
Without objection, the letter will be placed in the record. Under the chair's prior announcement, it is now in order to vote on those matters which were postponed. The question is now on amendment number 2, offered by Mr. Bishop to H.R. 1018, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Rahall? Mr. Rahall votes no. Mr. Hastings? Mr. Hastings votes aye. Mr. Miller? Mr. Danyang? Mr. Markey? Mr. Gallagly? Mr. Kildee? Mr. Duncan? Mr. DeFazio? Mr. Flake? Mr. Faliamavega? Mr. Faliamavega votes no. Mr. Brown? Mr. Abercrombie? Mrs. McMorris-Rogers? Mr. Pallone? Mr. Gomert? Mrs. Napolitano? Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mr. Holt? Mr. Schuster? Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Lamborn? Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Ms. Bordalio? Mr. Adrian Smith? Mr. Adrian Smith votes aye. Mr. Costa? Mr. Costa votes no. Mr. Woodman? Mr. Woodman votes aye. Mr. Bourne? Mr. Brown? Mr. Brown votes aye. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Mr. Fleming? Mr. Fleming votes aye. Mr. Heinrich? Mr. Heinrich votes no. Mr. Kaufman?
Aye.
Mr. Kaufman votes aye. Mr. Hinchy? Mr. Chaffetz? Mr. Chaffetz votes aye. Mrs. Christensen? Mrs. Christensen votes no. Mrs. Lummis? Mrs. Lummis votes aye. Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Kind? Mr. Cassidy? Mrs. Capps? Mrs. Capps votes no. Mr. Inslee? Mr. Inslee votes no. Mr. Baca? Ms. Herseth Handlin? Ms. Herseth Handlin votes no. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Ms. Shea Porter? Ms. Songus? Mr. Cradaville? Mr. Cradaville votes no. Mr. Pierluisi? Mr. Miller? Mr. Don Young? Mr. Markey? Mr. Gallagly? Mr. Kildee? Mr. Duncan? Mr. DeFazio? Mr. Flake? Mr. Flake votes aye. Mr. Brown? Mr. Abercrombie? Mrs. McMorris Rogers? Mr. Pallone? Mr. Gomert? Mr. Holt? Mr. Schuster? Ms. Bordalio? Mr. Boren? Mr. Hinchy? Mr. Kind? Mr. Cassidy? Mr. Baca? Ms. Shea Porter? Ms. Songus? Mr. Pierluisi? Mr. Abercrombie has not voted. Mr. Abercrombie? Mr. Abercrombie votes no. She's not been recorded. Ms. Shea Porter? Ms. Shea Porter votes no. Mr. Cassidy has not been recorded. Mr. Cassidy? No, I have not recorded you. Mr. Cassidy votes aye. Okay, Mr. Chairman, the ayes are 13 and the nays are 16. Mr. Rahall? Mr. Rahall votes no. Mr. Doc Hastings? Mr. Hastings votes aye. Mr. Miller. Mr. Danyang. Mr. Markey. Mr. Gallagly. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Duncan. Mr. DeFazio. Mr. Flake. Mr. Flake votes aye. Mr. Falliuma-Vega. Mr. Falliuma-Vega votes no. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown from South Carolina. Mr. Abercrombie. Mr. Abercrombie votes no. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Gomert. Mrs. Napolitano. Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mr. Holt. Mr. Schuster. Mr. Grijalva. Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Lamborn. Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Ms. Bordalio. Mr. Adrian Smith. Mr. Adrian Smith votes aye. Mr. Costa. Mr. Whitman. Mr. Whitman votes aye. Mr. Bourne. Mr. Brown from Georgia. Aye. Mr. Brown votes aye. Mr. Sablon. Mr. Fleming. Aye. Mr. Fleming votes aye. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich votes no. Mr. Kaufman.
Aye.
Mr. Kaufman votes aye. Mr. Hinchy. Mr. Chaffetz. Mr. Chaffetz votes aye. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen votes no. Mrs. Lummis. Mrs. Lummis votes aye. Mr. Gett. Mr. Gett votes no. Mr. McClintock. Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Kind. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy votes aye. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps votes no. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee votes no. Mr. Baca. Ms. Herseth-Sandlin. Ms. Herseth-Sandlin votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Ms. Shea Porter. Ms. Shea Porter votes no. Ms. Songus. Ms. Songus votes no. Mr. Cradaville. Mr. Cradaville votes no. Mr. Pierluisi. Mr. Miller. Mr. Danyang. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey votes no. Mr. Gallagly. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Duncan. Mr. DeFazio. Mr. Brown for South Carolina. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Gomert. Mr. Holt. No. Mr. Holt votes no. Mr. Schuster. Ms. Bordalio. Mr. Costa. Mr. Costa votes aye. Mr. Bourne. Mr. Sablon. Mr. Sablon votes no. Mr. Hinchy. Mr. Kind. Mr. Baca. Mr. Pierluisi. Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 15 and the nays are 19. 17.
Five offered by Mrs. Lomas to H.R. 1018. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Rahall.
No.
Mr. Rahall votes no. Mr. Doc Hastings. Aye. Mr. Doc Hastings votes aye. Mr. Miller. Mr. Don Young. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey votes no. Mr. Gallagly. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Duncan. Mr. DeFazio. Mr. Flake. Mr. Flake votes aye. Mr. Falliuma-Vega. Mr. Falliuma-Vega votes no. Mr. Brown for South Carolina. Mr. Abercrombie. Mr. Abercrombie votes no. Ms. McMorris-Rogers. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Gomert. Mrs. Napolitano. Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mr. Holt. Mr. Holt votes no. Mr. Schuster. Mr. Grijalva. Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Lamborn. Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Mr. Bordalio. Mr. Adrian Smith. Mr. Adrian Smith votes aye. Mr. Costa. Mr. Costa votes no. Mr. Whitman. Mr. Whitman votes aye. Mr. Boren. Mr. Brantford, Georgia. Mr. Brand votes aye. Mr. Sablon. Mr. Sablon votes no. Mr. Fleming. Mr. Fleming votes aye. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich votes no. Mr. Kaufman.
Aye.
Mr. Kaufman votes aye. Mr. Hinchy. Mr. Chaffetz. Mr. Chaffetz votes aye. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen votes no. Mrs. Lummis. Mrs. Lummis votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. McClintock. Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Kind. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy votes aye. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps votes no. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee votes no. Mr. Baca. Ms. Herseth Sandlin. Ms. Herseth Sandlin votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Ms. Shea Porter. Ms. Shea Porter votes no. Ms. Songus. Ms. Songus votes no. Mr. Cradiville. Mr. Cradiville votes no. Mr. Pierluisi.
As all members who have not voted seeking to vote. How is the gentleman from New York, Mr. Hinchy, recorded?
Has not been recorded. Mr. Hinchy votes no.
The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 14 and the nays are 20.
The amendment is not accepted. Questions now on the amendment in nature of substitute offered by the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Grijalva. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The amendment in nature of substitute is agreed to. The question is now in favor of reporting the bill as amendment to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the ayes have it. A roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Rahall.
Aye.
Mr. Rahall votes aye. Mr. Hastings. Mr. Hastings votes no. Mr. Miller. Mr. Don Young. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey votes aye. Mr. Gallagly. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Duncan. Mr. DeFazio. Mr. Flake. Mr. Flake votes no. Mr. Fali-Muvega. Mr. Fali-Muvega votes aye. Mr. Brown from South Carolina. Mr. Abercrombie. Mr. Abercrombie votes aye. Ms. McMorris-Rogers. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Gomert. Mrs. Napolitano. Mrs. Napolitano votes aye. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes no. Mr. Holt. Mr. Holt votes aye. Mr. Schuster. Mr. Grijalva. Mr. Grijalva votes aye. Mr. Lamborn. Mr. Lamborn votes no. Ms. Bordalio. Mr. Adrian Smith. Mr. Adrian Smith votes no. Mr. Costa. Mr. Costa votes no. Mr. Whitman. Mr. Whitman votes no. Mr. Boren. Mr. Brown from Georgia? No. Mr. Brown votes no. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes aye. Mr. Fleming? Mr. Fleming votes no. Mr. Heinrich? Mr. Heinrich votes aye. Mr. Kaufman?
Aye.
Mr. Kaufman votes aye. Mr. Hinchy? Mr. Hinchy votes aye. Mr. Chaffetz? Mr. Chaffetz votes no. Mrs. Christensen? Mrs. Christensen votes aye. Mrs. Lummis? Mrs. Lummis votes no. Mr. Gett? Mr. Gett votes aye. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Kind? Mr. Cassidy? Mr. Cassidy votes no. Mrs. Capps? Mrs. Capps votes aye. Mr. Inslee? Mr. Inslee votes aye. Mr. Baca? Ms. Herseth-Sandlin? Ms. Herseth-Sandlin votes no. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Mr. Shea Porter? Ms. Shea Porter? Ms. Shea Porter votes aye. Ms. Songus? Ms. Songus votes aye. Mr. Cradaville? Mr. Cradaville votes aye. Mr. Pierluisi?
Roll call vote. We will come back and do non-controversial bill after the votes on the floor. How is Mr. DeFazio recorded?
Mr. DeFazio has not been recorded. Mr. DeFazio votes aye.
Anybody on your side? Any other members wish to be recognized to vote? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 21 and the nays are 14.
The ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported to the House of Representatives as amended. Without objection, motion reconsidered is laid on the table.
Mr. Chairman, I just noticed that that gentle lady from Washington just showed up, and I don't think she was recorded on that. If we
By unanimous consent, we'll ask how is the gentle lady from Washington recorded?
She has not been recorded. Ms. McMorris-Rogers votes no.
well, we had
Gentle lady, show what for the record? Okay, for the record, we called the roll call again.
Final recorded vote.
yeah. Mr. Chairman, if I may, I note that the roll call was closed, and the gentle lady came in just at the end. Probably the proper procedure were if she were to say that if the roll call were open, she would have voted the way that she had voted, and I ask unanimous consent that if that's her intent, her statement appear in the record.
Without objection, that's the way it will occur. Chair thanks the gentleman from Washington. Okay, so the ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported to the House of Representatives as amended. Without objection, motion to reconsider is laid on the table. I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make necessary and technical changes to all the bills reported today, subject to the approval of the minority. Hearing no objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that for any bill order reported today with amendments, that the bill be considered read with an amendment to strike out all after the acting clause and insert the text of the bill with its perfecting amendments adopted in committee. Is there objection? Hearing none, it is so ordered.
Mr. Chairman.
The ranking Republican members, right?
Mr. Chairman, under Committee Rule 5C, I give notice of my intention to file additional or dissenting views on the bill just considered, and I ask unanimous consent that this notice be extended to all members of the committee and to apply to all bills being considered by the committee today.
Without objection, so ordered. The committee stands in recess to come back after the votes on the floor.